I would say a mix of both is probably the story of everything in my life. Since moving to the UK, and especially being at the Royal Conservatoire, it's been amazing that I feel I can bring all the parts of who I am as a musician and as a researcher together. Yeah, I would say I don't identify with the word entrepreneurial, but I will identify with the word very stubborn.
Welcome to the Academic Adventures podcast. This podcast is all about people who have embraced the opportunity to combine their academic work with entrepreneurial ventures. You'll hear about the highs and lows, balancing responsibilities and grabbing opportunities, plus advice for anyone thinking about following a similar path. Hello, I'm your host Sarah McCluskey, and my academic adventurer for the final episode of this series is Emily Doolittle. Emily is a lecturer and research fellow at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow. She is also an independent composer, working on commissions and personal projects alongside her academic work. Emily has a special interest in the relationship between animal songs and human music, which has led to some amazing collaborations and compositions, some of which you can hear on her website, and you'll find a link in the show notes. Over her career, Emily has been a full-time academic and a full-time composer, but her current role allows her to intertwine these different strands of her work. In marked contrast to other podcast guests, Emily doesn't label her collaborations as knowledge exchange or her freelance work as entrepreneurial, even though others might. She simply sees them as a channel for doing interesting work and getting it out into the world. Welcome along to the podcast, Emily. Lovely to have you here. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you combine academic work with other freelance work.
Yeah, a great question. It's always a sort of a constant juggling act, but I work at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland 4 days a week as an Athenaeum Research Fellow, and then about half a day a week as a lecturer in composition. And then besides that, I have quite a lot of commissions and collaborations, things I'm writing music for, either just myself or in collaboration with other people. But even things don't quite divide as neatly as that because a lot of my composition is actually also part of my academic research. So I think one of the things I really love about my position as a part-time research fellow at the Royal Conservatoire is that I do sort of have the flexibility. If I have some idea I'm wanting to find out more about, I can do traditional academic research about that idea. I can write music, exploring that idea as part of my practice-based research at the Conservatoire. But I can also look for outside partners to work with, whether there are other people at academic institutions or film producers or people in non-academic positions, but who might have relevant artistic or practical expertise to collaborate with.
Yeah, excellent. It's a really interesting mixture. And just to help the listeners understand how that all fits together, these projects that you're doing, are they through the university? Do you do them completely independently as a freelancer? Is it a bit of a mix of both?
I would say probably a mix of both is probably the story of everything in my life, really. Yeah, certainly I collaborate with other academics at my institution and at other institutions, in the UK and abroad as well. I'm from Canada originally, and I lived in the States for a number of years and also in the Netherlands. So I have a number of friends and collaborators sort of all over the place. So yeah, and I just thinking about, say, a project I'm working on right now. It's a chamber opera based on a Shetlandic folktale, which I started writing actually in 2012 and finished in 2018. It was sort of a project that went through many incarnations. And I first started working on the project with a non-academic amateur group in Shetland called Fancy Tunes. And then after I wrote the piece, we workshopped it there. We had it performed in Glasgow with a friend, with an ensemble run by a friend who is an academic friend, sort of a music friend outside of the conservatoire as well. But it's the ensemble thing, which is co-directed by John De Simone, who used to work at the conservatoire with me. So we had a live performance, but many of the performers we were working with were not from academic contexts. There were freelancers or, performers with various companies. And we also worked with friends of mine, Greenlight Creative, who are a film production company, but they also do costuming and things like that. So they're not an academic contact, but had exactly the right artistic expertise to complement the production. And then the stage director was somebody else who works at the conservatoire. So, Stassi Schaefer. So we had that live performance. Now we're working on an animated version of the chamber opera. So again, that involves a whole new array of contacts and funding sources who are all sort of intermingled between people at the conservatoire, people at other institutions, and people completely outside of academia, but with relevant expertise.
That's a really lovely example of how intertwined these parts of your life are. And is this always the way that you've worked through your career? Was this a particular path that you chose?
Yeah, I think it's always been how my mind and my interests have worked, but I feel like I've had more possibility to work in that way since moving to the UK 8 years ago. I'm from Canada originally and then lived in the States for a number of years. And in this, my previous employment was in the States. And in the States, generally speaking, most good academic positions are full time. So you're either working full time and probably not having a lot of time for projects outside of that, or you might have a very, very part time adjunct position, which doesn't really give you enough to live. So then you're probably also working somewhere else to try to to make a living. So and then in the States, they also don't really have the concept of artistic research or practice-based research. So in the position I had teaching composition at an arts college in the States, when I wanted to do academic research, I had to take unpaid time off my academic position. So since moving to the UK, and especially being at the Royal Conservatoire as a research fellow, it's been amazing that I feel like I can bring all the parts of who I am as a musician and as a researcher together. And if there's an idea I'm interested in exploring, for another example, I do a lot of research in the relationship between animal songs and human music. And that's something that I explore, through writing music, but also through writing musicology papers, sort of about the history of how people hear and interpret animal songs, and also in collaborative research with scientists. And I really love the fact that I can think, okay, I'm interested in an idea, but I don't even have to know exactly how I want to explore it before I've started. So, I'll have, say, the song of a particular bird. Maybe by the time I'm done thinking about it, I'll have written a scientific paper together with some other people and a musicology paper by myself, and also maybe traditionally notated piece of music, and maybe also something that's a little bit more theatrical and performative that has a lot of input from the performer as well, all exploring one particular animal song. And for me, it's great that I don't have to define what I'm interested in before I know where it's going to lead. And I think, sort of connecting with the topic of working both inside and outside of academia as well. Say some of these ideas might work really well. Maybe I'll collaborate with a scientist in academia, but I could also collaborate with a botanic garden or, a charity that benefits nature or something like that. So it's great to feel like I don't have to cut off possible connections before I've even made them. It's great to feel like everything's possible.
That sounds like a really rich way of approaching the research. And I imagine that for you, the term knowledge exchange perhaps has a slightly different nuance to what it does to other people.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. When I think of knowledge exchange, I think of our knowledge exchange officer, Deborah Keogh, who is just brilliant at finding opportunities that, as an academic and an artist, I might look at the call for proposals and think, well, that's for people in business. That's not for me. And Deborah is incredibly brilliant at helping me and other people at the conservatoire recognize how actually this is relevant. And maybe we have to use slightly different terms to explain our work, but actually the funding and the infrastructure and the support can be there to help us develop what we're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. Great to have that support there.
Yeah.
So I wonder if with this path that you've taken now, it sounds very integrated with sort of who you are as a person. Was there a point where you chose this as a route, this combining academic work and then the freelance work? Or is it something that's sort of evolved over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I'm not very good at doing things I don't want to do or I'm not interested in doing. So, in that sense, it's sort of inevitable. Like, with my job that I had in the States, which, you know, I loved many aspects of it. And of course, I love teaching composition. But I ended up, because I didn't have time to pursue the academic research I wanted to do as well. And it's actually an essential part of my composition and who I am as a teacher too. I ended up working 3/4 time or half time a lot of the time just so I could, sort of do all the things that are important to me. But in a US context, that's not really sustainable. Like they don't really encourage you or necessarily
Mhm.
even allow you to work half time or full time. So I was lucky to make things work for a few years there, but it wouldn't have been really sustainable as an academic career. So it's been, but there's always the option of being a freelancer, which of course, is very difficult, especially in the current climate when so much arts funding is being cut. But also, that's not my ideal at all because I really like working as part of a team. I love the inspiration and support that comes from having colleagues. So although I had considered the possibility of becoming a freelancer again, this is really, I feel like the current position I'm in really offers the best of all worlds, where I get to pursue these artistic ideas that I'm really interested in, but I also get to have great colleagues, and I learn so much from seeing what other people are doing. Sometimes we give each other feedback on work or grant proposals or whatever, but sometimes even if somebody's doing something totally different from me, and there's maybe nothing that it'd be very hard for us to talk directly, to apply ideas directly from one idea to another. I just am so inspired by seeing people who work really differently from me or have really different kinds of ideas. So, yeah, I think it's really the best of all worlds being able to pursue artistic research, but in a collaborative, collegial context.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. You've mentioned there the challenges that you had working in the US system and the academic system and the way that the current system works much better for you. Are there any other things that you found particularly challenging about following this path?
So I think one thing that's challenging in terms of getting things funded that are, say, artistic projects that have funding needs beyond what an academic institution could provide, it's challenging in a circumstance where artistic organizations are having their budgets cut right and left. So, and I mean that's true in Canada where I'm from and in the States, which never had good funding to begin with, and here. So, say if I wanted to put something on, say a restaging my chamber opera or doing this animation of the chamber opera that I'm really hoping to do, it's increasingly difficult to find large amounts of funding. It's also increasingly competitive to get small amounts of funding. So you spend more and more time writing grant applications and you get less and less for them. So, I'm very, very stubborn. So I feel quite optimistic that we will eventually do a full scale, 20, probably 25-minute animated version of my chamber opera. But we need to raise about £200,000 for that because animation is very expensive if it's undone. And, I suspect we're going to probably end up putting that £200,000 together out of £10,000 here and £5,000 there. It's going to be a very labor intensive process. So I think maybe we'll get lucky and we'll find something that funds more of it. But I think for me, that's one of the biggest challenges, that you have to spend more and more time applying for less and less. And I guess sort of hand in hand with that problem is that I see a lot of arts funders are asking more and more questions as well. So maybe I think there's a situation where, perhaps there's an arts funding organization that they've recognized that funding has not been distributed entirely equally in the past. So then they do, genuinely want to be more equitable, which is fair, but they do that by asking another question, and then they realize it's still inequitable in some way, and so then they add another question, and then suddenly you're writing like 8,000 words for having a 1 in 25 chance of getting £3,000, and that's not good. So I think
Yeah.
the general funding situation is the biggest challenge right now.
Funding is always a bit of a challenge, isn't it, for whatever it is that you're doing. You've mentioned there, though, these practical things that make things better. So one of them's funding. You've
Yeah.
mentioned Deborah,
Yeah.
who's been really supportive
Never
of
makes
you.
things better, for sure.
Are there any other practical things that you've found have helped you to combine these different parts of your life?
Yeah. I think one thing that I've really gotten a lot of energy and inspiration from, again, is working with people, in different fields, whether they're, different arts fields in the conservatoire, or different academic fields, or people working in industry or in nonprofit organizations or whatever, but just seeing different ways people work and seeing different things people feel like they can do or feel would be easy or difficult. I feel like it's, in a sense, given me a lot of courage that if I have an idea, there's probably a way it makes sense and a way we can make it work. Like, I feel like it's just helped me feel, yeah, braver about trying things and seeing what happens, and talking to different people and seeing how they would approach it and seeing what ideas they've tried and so on.
I recognize that you don't particularly resonate with the word entrepreneurial, but you do seem to have quite an entrepreneurial mindset. This sort of, we'll get a bit of funding from here, a bit of funding from there. If you've got an idea, you want to make it happen. Do you think that's something that was in you? Or do you think it's something that's developed over time, or that you've done training to help? Anything like that?
Yeah, I feel like anybody who survives as an artist into, middle age is going to be, have that spirit of making things happen no matter what. Because there's always going to be so many setbacks along the way. So you always have to, keep your mind focused on what you want to do, while also being open to going in different directions. Like if I'm planning on making a 25-minute animated film of my chamber opera, but there's funding out there for a 28-minute film, then of course it can be, you have to not be so focused that you don't take opportunities that would actually be really great for you. Uh, but you do have to keep focused on the core of what you want to do, and always look for different ways of making it happen.
Yeah, I think that, and as I say, I think whatever you call it, that sense of doing what you need to do to make things happen, I
Yeah,
think is at the core of any venture, isn't it? Any
absolutely.
successful
Yeah. Right.
project.
Yeah. I would say I don't identify with the word entrepreneurial, but I will identify with the word very stubborn.
Absolutely fair enough. And so it sounds like you've got a lot of different things going on. You've got the teaching, you've got the research, you've got these other projects you've got on the
Yeah,
go as well. How do you manage to balance all those different responsibilities? I'm sure you've got home responsibilities as well.
absolutely. Yeah. That is a really good question. And I'm always sort of wondering that. One thing I sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier, where, when I had an academic position that was all teaching composition, that didn't feel balanced. I mean, teaching is great. I love teaching, but I didn't have enough time for composing. I didn't have enough time for my academic research. And after my first child was born, I didn't have enough time for my child. Now I have two children, so things felt quite unbalanced. But during the period when I was a freelancer, I also, I felt too isolated. Like it seems like it's going to be this great freedom to just be able to write music all the time, but actually very quickly you learn that you need structure in your life, and actually I missed, in a sense, doing things other people wanted me to do or contributing to a team or something. So I think it's always, for me at least, it's always about keeping those things in balance. Like, when are you need enough time to pursue your own ideas. You need enough time to give things to other people where you're really thinking about what they need or they're learning. You need time to get absorbed in other people's ideas. So I love it when somebody invites me to be part of a project, but it's their vision and I get to, participate in that. I just recently uh, co authored a paper with four other people: Pral Kringwatana, Rudy Nager, Alex South, and Martin Ulrich. And the paper is actually on music and animal welfare contexts, which is not my area of expertise at all, but we just sort of started a discussion group. And then Pral, who's a biologist, that is her area of research, she sort of led the creation of this paper. And I just loved that I got to use my knowledge and ideas, but towards something that I never would have thought of doing on my own. So I think for me, I need that balance of, my own work, teaching or giving things to other people, and then being absorbed in other people's ideas sometimes.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it sounds like, yeah, that to some people it might look from the outside very busy and complicated, but actually that's what you enjoy.
I do enjoy having a balance of things. Sometimes it gets the thing I struggle with, I think, when there's a deadline coming up for something, then I love the clarity of knowing what's coming next. And in fact, I recently wrote my first ever music for media for an Audible audiobook of Anne of Green Gables, which was a totally new way of working for me. There was a huge amount of music to write in a very short period of time. And I was given, a list of cues to write for. And so in a way it seemed, very busy and difficult, but actually in a sense, those 2 months were quite easy. The 2 months I was writing the music were quite easy for me, if not for the rest of my family. But, I just knew every morning when I woke up what I had to do.
Yeah.
I just woke up and wrote music until it was done. And I've actually found it more difficult since finishing that and trying to figure out, okay, what do I catch up on next? Like, I think not knowing what I need to do next when there's a lot of things that should be done, but not in a particular timeline, I find that harder than when I know what I need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a challenge, certainly something I find challenging as well.
Yeah.
It sounds like perhaps when you've talked as well about your journey that you've gone through, that perhaps what feels like success to you now is different to perhaps what you thought it was in the past.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've just been thinking about this recently because I feel like since, I turned 50 last year, now I'm 51, and there was the pandemic, and coming out of the pandemic, there's moving to Scotland, kids getting a bit older, so I have more time to think. And I do feel like I've sort of gone through a shift in maybe what my goals are or what I'm interested in. And I think part of that shift is like, when I was younger and sort of more, more early career as a composer, I was maybe thinking more about who am I? What kind of music do I write? What truly represents me? And I think that was the same in my research. Like, I've been really interested in the relationship between animal songs and human music for about 25 years. And I'm always looking for new ways to explore that. And I think, that's always going to be a really important part of who I am. I'm not looking at all to change what I already do. But I have in the past few years been thinking more about, okay, what are things that I think are not what I do, but they could actually become part of what I do? I've really started to value just like, being faced with a situation and thinking, okay, I don't really know how I would approach that, but could I figure it out? Maybe I can. Maybe I'll give that a try
Mm.
too. So yeah, I think I'm quite interested in seeing, even, thinking about different kinds of music, or, I'm sort of curious, I think about there's kinds of music I might write, kinds of music I don't write, whether I like it or not. There's kinds of music I don't like very much, or there's kinds of music I love, but I don't feel like I could write. But now I'm starting to think, well, could I write that? Could I get
Mm.
interested in that? And I think it's a really interesting exercise and process, and super fun to find yourself connecting with, new kinds of sounds or ideas or projects that, maybe 10 years ago I couldn't have imagined myself doing.
Yeah, and maybe that confidence and curiosity that's just come with the experience as well.
Yeah, yeah. But I think also, certainly maybe the pandemic forced us to narrow what we were doing so much during the years we had to be at home so much, and or could only do things online, or just didn't have a lot of possibilities. And I think the process of trying to re-expand coming out of not that we're totally out of the pandemic, but coming out of lockdown, and how freeing it's felt to go back to doing the things I used to do, and then realizing actually I don't have to just go back to that. I can go back to a lot more than that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Nice to feel that freedom.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, as we come towards the end of our conversation, if there's somebody else, perhaps not necessarily just in music, maybe just in a kind of creative situation, who would be considering following a similar path to you, what advice would you give them?
I mean, I guess my advice is to be friendly and curious and meet a lot of people and see what possibilities are there. I think, like I said earlier, that it's very important to be stubborn. And I think it's very important to be stubborn, but not in the sense of if you knock on one door and it doesn't open, keep banging on that door. That's not going to help you. It's more in the sense of like always looking for new connections and new possibilities. And I know a number of times in my life, I've sort of been in a situation where, maybe there were several things I wanted to do, and one of them seemed to be happening quite easily, and the other one, the doors seemed to be closed. And I think it's always good to like go where the current is taking you. There was an article written a few years ago by a poet named Kim Liao called "Why You Should Aim for 100 Rejections a Year." And she was talking about her process of just sending out 100 poems to literary journals every year. And I sort of adopted that idea for my own work. And of course, different fields are different. There's no way I could write 100 grant applications a year, and I've never aimed for that. But I do try to, I would say every year I aim for like applying for 100 things, but I count that very broadly. So it could be just if a friend says, "Hey, do you have for a piece for piano?" and just giving them a PDF of the piece I already have, or whatever it is. So I count very small wins the same as I count a big grant application. I've never made it to 100. The most I've ever done is 67. Some years, I'm already quite busy and I don't send anything out because I don't actually want more projects. But I think the general idea that if I'm feeling isolated, instead of sitting at home feeling sorry for myself because I don't have a project, just get out there and try to make connections, but don't get too hung up on any one. It's more like getting your work out there and seeing what it connects with. And maybe it won't, maybe you'll send your piece to somebody and they're just not interested. That's totally fine. There's no way anybody's going to be interested in everything. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that person or anything wrong with you. You're just setting up the possibilities to make the connections that that could or could not spark and lead to something in the future. So I think that's very important for me in my approach. But I also just want to acknowledge that we are living during really difficult times where, I feel like even 10 years ago, there was more funding and food was cheaper and people were maybe financially a little bit more secure. So I wanted to say that advice has been really important for me. And I think it will be quite important for other people too, while acknowledging that it's also not going to be possible or good advice for everybody. And we need better arts funding and infrastructure for everybody.
Yeah, well, I think the good advice, but also, as you say, with that caveat for the current situations that we're in. So
Yep.
I think it just remains to say thank you very much for taking the time to come along and tell us about your story.
Thanks so much. It's been great chatting with you.
If you've been inspired by this podcast, head over to our LinkedIn page and tell us about your biggest takeaways. You'll find a link in the show notes or just search for Academic Adventures Podcast. This podcast is a collaboration between the University of the West of Scotland, Converge and Sarah McCluskey. The podcast team includes Orla Kelly, Adam Kosterka, Jen Black and me, Sarah McCluskey. The Academic Adventures podcast is proudly supported by the Scottish Ecosystem Fund 2023 to 2024.